to welcome Father Steven Payne from the Carmelites, from the Discalced Carmelites, and also from the Catholic University of America. Father Steven, what is the name of your particular center at the Catholic University of America?
Yes, it's called the Center for Carmelite Studies, and you're welcome to come visit us. We're up on the top floor of Caldwell Hall, so you have to do a lot of ascending Mount Carmel to get up there. Yeah.
Or if you're out of state, you might want to visit their website.
we do have a website, and in fact, we're working on a new one. So hopefully things will be improved fairly soon. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Father Steven. And I turn it over to you to talk to us about Saint Thérèse of Lisieux.
Sure. And you'll handle admitting all of those who are coming later then, I guess, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Well, welcome everybody. And as usual, I'm going to use some PowerPoint slides to give my presentation so that you don't have to look at a talking head for an hour and a half. Just to say a little bit more about the recordings, we're also going to try to put a link to them on our Center for Carmelite Studies website. But as LJ was saying, some of that is still to be worked out because we have to get the links all correct. And the John of the Cross talk didn't record, so I will probably try to do that again and post it there. But give us a week or two before you get too impatient. Remember what Teresa says: patience attains everything. So let me go to share screen and to what I want to share about Thérèse. And hold on one second here. I'm going to expand it and do the slideshow here. Can you all hear me well enough? I hope. Yeah. Okay, good.
Yes, very well, Father Steven. Thank you.
Sure, I'll continue, but now while I'm doing this, I can't see you. So if there's any problem, just send a message to or in chat to LJ or something like that, and we'll try to adjust if you're having any problems during this. Okay, so this is the last in the series of the Lenten talks that we're giving on the four Carmelite mystics, and this one is on Thérèse of Lisieux. Also known as Therese of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. You see her dates there. She died at the young age of 24, but she's become one of the best known saints in the Catholic Church. I mentioned last time when I was doing Brother Lawrence that one of the challenges with Brother Lawrence is that what he wrote is so brief that I could have read the whole thing to you in the time of the conference. Well, in Therese's case, there's a different sort of problem, which is that she is so well known that probably there are many people who are listening tonight who know more about her than I do, or could give this presentation better than I could. So I'm well aware of my limitations in that regard. I find that whenever I give a talk on Saint Therese to a group of Carmelite nuns, for example, they often have to correct me because they know her backwards and forwards. They know everything about her. And it's interesting to think that with somebody who died at the age of 24, that there seems to be no end to publications about her, new books about her, conferences about her, and so on. And so I think everyone has their own particular view of Thérèse too, their favorite passages and so on. So hopefully some of what I say will resonate with that, but you may also have other things that you find particularly appealing in her. So let's begin with a little prayer. And for the prayer, I'd like to just read an excerpt from Story of a Soul, where she talks about her discovery of her little way. She says, "I have always wanted to be a saint. Alas, I have always noticed that when I compared myself to the saints, there is between them and me the same difference that exists between a mountain whose summit is lost in the clouds and the obscure grain of sand trampled underfoot by passers-by. Instead of becoming discouraged, I said to myself, God cannot inspire unrealizable desires. I can then, in spite of my littleness, aspire to holiness. It is impossible for me to grow up, and so I must bear with myself such as I am, with all my imperfections. But I want to seek out a means of going to heaven by a little way, a way that is very straight, very short, and totally new. We are living now in an age of inventions. I wanted to find an elevator which would raise me to Jesus, for I am too small to climb the rough stairway of perfection. I searched then in the scriptures for some sign. The elevator which must raise me to heaven is your arms, O Jesus. And for this I had no need to grow up, but rather I had to remain little and become this more and more. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, pray for us. Now, I abbreviated some of that passage. It's worth going to the Story of a Soul and reading the whole text, but that would take us too long here. I've mentioned in every conference so far that I'm being guided by Professor Bernard McGinn's notion of mysticism, because we're talking about four Carmelite mystics. And he says that he understands mysticism as that part or element of Christian belief and practice that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the effect of what the mystics themselves have described as a direct and transformative presence of God. And I said that this fits well with the spirituality of the Carmelites, because the Carmelites have always recognized that they're called to stand in the presence of the living God, like Elijah, who says, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand. So we've been looking at our Carmelite mystics for what they can tell us about trying to live in God's presence today. And so that's the angle at which we're approaching Thérèse as well. So what about her? I mean, she is really a remarkable saint, a remarkable person. Pius XI called her a miracle of grace and a prodigy of miracles. But at the time of her death, at 24 in 1897, she was hardly known outside of her own convent and the family circle. This was where she was buried initially. You see, Sister Thérèse of the Infant Jesus in the Lisieux cemetery. But within a few years, she was being hailed as the greatest saint of modern times. It's what Pius X said. And as I just mentioned, Pius XI called her a miracle of grace and a prodigy of miracles. And her beatification in 1923, we're almost up to the anniversary of that, and the canonization in 1925 came more quickly than any previous causes up to that point, according to the process that was in use at the time. Now that's been changed a bit with Pope John Paul II. And as you know, we've had some saints canonized fairly quickly these days, like Mother Teresa and so on. But at that time, there was a rule about waiting 50 years after the person's death before you could even start talking about beatification. But the story goes that in the Vatican, they were saying, well, we better hurry up and canonize Thérèse because the people are already canonizing her, that she was already regarded as a saint. In 1927, 2 years after her canonization, she was named co-patron of the missions with Francis Xavier. And interestingly, that was at the request of missionaries. This wasn't something that the Carmelites were pushing. This was something the missionaries wanted. In 1944, she was declared co-patron of France, along with Joan of Arc. In 1997, and you see this icon here representing this, she was named a doctor of the church by John Paul II, the third woman to be so named, Catherine of Siena, Teresa, and then Thérèse, and the youngest of all the doctors at 24. UNESCO recently has selected her as a World Heritage Person among those that are going to be honored in 2022, 2023 for their work on behalf of peace, science, and education. Now, I mean, UNESCO isn't honoring her just as a religious figure. She's had such an impact on the world in general that she's going to be honored next year. And those are just a few of the accolades that have come her way, and innumerable congregations, theologians, writers, artists, and so on have been inspired by Therese. And her influence has spread even beyond the bounds of institutional Catholicism to include other Christians, even those of other faiths. This is a cover of a book. You see kind of Therese's face there, kind of shadowy over the mountain there. This is a book about Therese and Martin Luther, written by the auxiliary Lutheran Bishop of Uppsala in Sweden. So, I mean, making a comparison between these figures. So I think no presentation can really do justice to all there is to say about Therese, but I'm going to begin with her life story, which is, I think, particularly important for Therese, even more than for the others we've talked about in this series, because her life is so much inseparable from her message. Therese was not trained academically, but she was a great thinker, a great reflective person. And so much of her insight came from reflecting on the challenges of her own life in the light of faith. So let's talk about her life a bit. These are some photos. One of the great things about Therese is that her sister Celine brought a camera into the Carmel. So we have lots of photos of Therese. I mean, there are a lot of saints of whom we have only one or two photos, but we have a lot of images of Therese. So she was born Marie Françoise Thérèse Martin, the youngest child of Zélie and Guérin and Louis Martin, who were, as you may know, the first spouses to be canonized as a couple. So now her parents are canonized saints, Louis and Zélie. And they had 9 children, and 5 girls out of the 9 survived into adulthood. There were 2 boys and 2 girls that died as infants or young children. Some of them died after a month or so, but some lived 2 or 3 years, but they lost 4, but the 5 girls survived. The family was devout, kind of French middle class, politically conservative, typical Catholic family there. But I mean, except for the fact that perhaps much more devout than many other families. Louis was a watchmaker and Zélie was a lace maker when they met and married in Alençon. And Therese was born there in 1873. During her first year, Therese, though, had to be separated from her mother because her mother had breast cancer and her health was declining, so she wasn't able to nurse Therese. So they sent her away to a wet nurse for a year, and then she came back to the family. But she loses her mother to breast cancer at the age of 4. And one of the interesting things about Therese, and you can tell this when you read her story of a soul, is she had a phenomenal memory, and she could remember things from very early in her childhood. I think more so than most of us. I can't remember as far back as she did, but she remembered her mother's death and how it affected her and so on. She becomes increasingly, after this, timid and hypersensitive. And, with her mother gone now, the 2 youngest daughters, Celine and Therese, sort of spontaneously choose one of their older sisters as mother. And Celine chooses Marie, the oldest, and Therese says, well, I choose Pauline. She's going to be my second mama. So she chose her sister Pauline as her second mother. But then Pauline suddenly departs to join the Carmelite nuns in Lisieux in 1882. And, I guess they didn't think that this, that Therese would notice about all of this and so on. So she wasn't really prepared for it. This kind of took her by surprise. And Therese has a crisis at this point, and she comes down with what they call a mysterious sickness. Headaches, trembling, and so on. If I recall, like the first time this happened was when they were at her uncle's house, and her uncle was talking about Therese's mother, and so on. So, I mean, the psychologists, and so on, debate about to what extent was this psychosomatic. But she was having some serious physical problems there. And the family didn't know what to do. And in fact, they were kind of at their wits' end when Therese has this experience of they put a statue of Our Lady, what they call Our Lady of the Smile, in the room where she was. And she looks at it and she sees Mary smiling at her. And as it says in that quote, Our Lady's face was ineffably sweet, tender, and compassionate, but what touched me to the very depths of my soul was her gracious smile. Then all my pain vanished. One way of looking at it is, Therese had lost all of these mothers, a whole sequence of them, and that was a big gap in her life. And now she's discovering, or she's got Mary, a mother on whom she can always rely. Therese makes her first communion when she's 11 in 1884, but she's still emotionally fragile. She's unhappy at school. Eventually, they pull her out of school. And then her oldest sister, Marie, enters the Carmel in 1886. Therese is all of this is difficult for her, and she's still very emotionally fragile. She talks about how she would cry at the slightest thing, and then she would cry for having cried. But she, in Story of a Soul, she talks about an important change that came about on Christmas just before her 14th birthday, what is called her Christmas conversion, or the Christmas miracle. When she and Celine and her father, Louis, came home from Christmas midnight mass, she was going upstairs, and Louis said something sharp about how, that they had the custom of putting treats and so on in the shoes of the children. And he says, well, hopefully we won't have to do this again next year. And ordinarily that would have crushed Therese. She would have burst into tears, but she suddenly found the strength to come down and be joyful and to celebrate and to please her father and so on. And she says that, after all this time struggling with her nature, she said, suddenly I felt charity enter into my soul and the need to forget myself and please others. And since then I've been happy. So it marked a step beyond. She always remained a sensitive person, I would say, but she was no longer so much at the mercy of her emotions. And one of the signs of this now was the following summer, now we're 1887, she hears about this murderer, Henry Pranzini, who is refusing any sort of ministry or anything in his final days. He's been sentenced to execution for these terrible murders that he committed. Therese decides to adopt him as a kind of a spiritual child and pray for his conversion, and she has masses said for him and so on. And she learns from the newspapers, which she wasn't supposed to read, but she read anyway, that at the last moment, just before he's to be executed, Pranzini took the crucifix and kissed it. So Therese took this as a sign that her prayers had been effective and that she had this important role in helping to save souls, and that's what she wanted to do with her life. This was one of the things she wanted to do in Carmel. She, of course, she had two sisters who'd already joined Carmel, but she said she wasn't joining just to be with them, but because she felt attracted to Carmel and this vocation of praying for souls, and especially praying for priests. So she goes to the bishop with her father and asks permission to enter Carmel early. And this is one of the pictures of her. She says, well, she put her hair up so she would look a little older. She's just this young teenager. But she has to wait. And so while they're waiting, she and her father and her sister Celine go on a pilgrimage pilgrimage group to Rome. And there's a famous story that in November now, not 1897, I have the wrong date there. That's the year she died. During the pilgrim's audience with Leo the 13th, she asked the Pope for permission to enter Carmel at 15. They weren't supposed to speak to the Pope, but she got the gumption to do so. And Pope Leo didn't quite understand what she was asking for, but when it was clarified, he says to her, well, you will enter if God wills it, which was a diplomatic response, but and Therese took it in a positive way, but she was disappointed that things weren't moving more quickly. She had to wait a little longer. But on April 9th, 1888, she's 15 years old. Therese finally enters the Carmel of Lisieux, and she's by far the youngest member there. The next year, she receives the habit and she starts signing her name, Sister Therese of the Child Jesus and of the Holy Face. Now, a lot of times people just know her as Therese of the Child Jesus, but of the Holy Face was also a very important part of her spirituality, as I'll say something about it later. 1890, she makes her profession of final vows. So, I mean, she's still a teenager. But this had been very difficult for her father to let her go because she was the baby of the family. He was especially close to her. He gave his permission, but soon after, now his health is declining, and he begins to have hallucinations and so on, and he ends up getting confined to an asylum. And for Therese, this was a great cross because people were saying, well, it's Therese's fault. Her father's heart was broken and he lost his mind when his daughter went into the convent. She knew that was what people were saying. It reminded her, though, of their shared devotion to the Holy Face. I guess one of the things that Louis would do was he would put a cloth over his face at times, just kind of almost like hiding in shame. But it reminded Therese of the Veronica's veil and all of that. And she kind of identified the suffering face of Christ with what her father was going through too. So Therese tells us in Story of a Soul, that's what SOS means, Story of a Soul. Therese writes that upon her entry, I found religious life to be exactly as I had imagined it. No sacrifice astonished me, and yet my first steps met with more thorns than roses. Yes, suffering opened wide its arms to me, and I threw myself into them with love. It was not easy joining this community. This community had its problems and had its problem people, and she's the youngster, and she has to adapt to a community where many are her age of her parents and so on. But she participates fully in the regular life, and she serves in various capacities as sacristan and so on. The picture in the upper left there is that's her family, her other sisters there, and a cousin there. You see Therese in the background with the ciborium, putting hosts in the chalice. On the right side is Therese at laundry. There's a story about how one of the sisters used to splash her doing the laundry. And I don't know if she's being splashed in that picture or not, but that was the community at laundry day. And down below, they're haying. They're gathering up hay, the community. So she was just a regular member of the community. Nobody was noticing anything particularly special about her. And interestingly, she never actually moved out of the novitiate wing into the main part of the community, because after her own novitiate and profession, she was asked to stay on to help work with the newcomers, with the novices. And she gets appointed assistant novice mistress. So she's working with the ones coming behind her in formation. And it gets kind of awkward when her sister Celine, who's a couple years older than her, but who had stayed out to help take care of the father, now joins the same community. So you have four sisters in the same community, and Therese ends up being Celine's formator. You can imagine the younger sister trying to tell the older sister how to live the life, but they made it work. And Therese began writing poems, community plays, and so on. Like she was a great admirer of Joan of Arc. So this is her acting in one of the plays they put on about Joan of Arc. That's not her real hair. That's a wig over the habit, actually. I read somebody who was complaining that Therese kept her long hair in the Carmel. No, that's a wig anyway. But that's her as Joan of Arc. And you see in the picture on the left there, she's you see the lamb in front, and then the white veil behind the lamb, and then Therese is just behind her. In 1895, she's 21 years old. She and her sisters are at recreation talking about some of their childhood memories. And Therese, as I said, had a great memory, so she was telling stories and so on. And one of the sisters says to Pauline, who by this time is the prioress, says, why don't you tell Therese to write these down? So Mother Agnes Pauline says, yes, Therese, write down your memories. Now, I mean, Pauline didn't realize how seriously Therese took that, because Therese goes off and then starts writing what becomes the first 8 chapters of Story of a Soul. And then sometime later, she puts all of that at her Pauline's place in the choir, and Pauline doesn't even look at it for some time. She didn't think it was anything significant initially, just, you know, anecdotes from childhood. Then on Trinity Sunday, June 9th, she makes her famous oblation to merciful love. She wants to offer herself as a victim to God's love rather than God's justice. As I'll say a little later on, it was kind of typical of popular piety in the Carmels and elsewhere there for nuns to kind of offer themselves as victims to God's justice. The idea being that sinners had committed so many sins for which deserve punishment, and that, you know, asking God to give, you know, put that punishment on me to satisfy your justice so that it will alleviate the punishment that's due, that they deserve, and so on. But that wasn't Therese's way. She wanted to be a victim of God's love, because she figured, you know, there's so many who aren't accepting God's love. So, you know, she wanted to accept it and let it transform her. Another thing that happens is she's asked to pray for 2 missionaries. This is a custom that still continues to this day in some of the Carmels, which is that priests will come, or seminarians will come, or they'll write to a Carmel and say, you know, I'm being sent to the missions. I would like for one of your sisters to be praying for me on the missions. And so she was assigned to this Maurice Bellier and Adolphe Rouland. She saw this as providential, because she, you know, she had lost 2 older brothers in their infancy, you know, the two sons who had died, that she had hoped would one day be priests, and that would never be, of course. So here God had given her 2 other brothers. I mean, Therese was already interested in the missions, but this just increased it enormously. She had this tremendous zeal. She's writing regularly to them. She's praying for them, and so on. She's giving them all her support. In fact, that, if I remember right, that particular picture there in the circle, is she's got a book there on the ledge that had been given her by Father Rouland, the one below, and she has on her on the piece of paper that she's holding, she had written the words something like, "I would sacrifice 1,000 lives to save one soul." The one who needed her help particularly was the one above, this Maurice Bellier. In fact, there's a whole book written about the relationship between Therese and Maurice. And it's a very good book by Bishop Ahern, if you're interested. I think it's called Maurice and Therese, or Therese and Maurice, I forget, the love story. You know, she wrote them letters, and these letters got published, and later on, after her death, missionaries became very interested in Therese, because they knew how much she loved the missions, and you know, that snowballed into her becoming co-patron of the missions. Then on April 3rd, 1896, it's Good Friday, and she experiences her first, I think the way you pronounce it is hemoptysis, which is she coughed up blood. And that happened again, I think, well, a couple of times in that during the Triduum there. So, you know, she realizes this is serious, and maybe she's not going to live so long. Interestingly too, then Easter is when it begins her great trial of faith. You know, up till that point, she'd always had this very vivid sense of the reality of heaven. It just, she couldn't not believe in it. You know, it was as real as the room around us to her. But now all of a sudden that becomes obscure. She talks about this in Story of a Soul too. She says, "At that time I was enjoying such a living faith, such a clear faith, that the thought of heaven made up all my happiness, and I was unable to believe that there were really impious people who had no faith. Then Jesus permitted my soul to be invaded by the thickest darkness, and the thought of heaven until then so sweet to me was no longer anything but the cause of struggle and torment. And she writes about this with a certain hesitation in Story of a Soul, because she says she doesn't want to upset anybody by what she's describing, but that she talks about how it was like hearing a voice telling her, you think you're going to heaven, but it's something much worse than that. It's utter nothingness. She has faith she wants to believe, but she's not feeling it the way she used to. But her oldest sister, Marie, now, in the meantime, has learned about Therese's little way, and she wants a more extensive account. So Therese writes her a long letter, which she says, well, Marie, I'm going to address it to Jesus. And so it becomes kind of in the form of a long prayer. But that later becomes chapter 9 of Story of a Soul. And at this point now, her sisters, are the members of the convent are beginning to realize that Therese is sick, and she's got tuberculosis, and things don't look good. And her sister, Pauline, realizes that if Therese dies now, they're going to have to write an obituary letter for her. This is what they always do in the Carmels. They send around a kind of a long letter talking about the person's life and their characteristics and their virtues and so on. But Pauline, she has she has that document, those memories that Therese had written for her up till the time she entered the Carmelites. But Pauline, by this time, Mother Marie Gonzaga has been elected. Pauline goes to her and says, well, why don't you have Therese write some more about her life in Carmel? Because we don't have that. We just have her memories up till the time she enters. And so Marie de Gonzague says, yes, has Therese do that. And that becomes what we know as chapters 10 and 11 of Story of the Soul. And at the same time, as Therese is getting sicker, the sisters are visiting her in the infirmary, and they're taking down her sayings, her words, and so on. And later on, these will be published as what they call the Last Conversations. And it's in the Last Conversations that you'll find some of the most famous quotations from Therese, such as, I will spend my heaven doing good on earth, or after my death, I will let fall a shower of roses. She doesn't write that in Story of a Soul. That comes from her Last Conversations. So, I mean, physically, she's suffering more and more. It's really painful. She even tells one of the sisters that if it weren't for her faith, she understands what would motivate people to commit suicide. But her final words are, my God, I love you. And she dies on September 30th. That's the feast of St. Jerome, so that couldn't be her feast, and it's now on October 1st. But very soon after, she's buried in Lisieux Cemetery, and most people thought, well, okay, that's that. She was a nice nun, but that's the story. So how did Therese go from becoming a sister to a saint? This book we know as Story of a Soul was put together originally by Pauline, her older sister in Carmel, Mother Agnes, in place of the usual death notice. The idea being that, well, rather than just sending around this short circular letter, we have this material, it's good, let's put it together and publish it as a book and send that around as our notice for Therese's death. Now, Pauline was commissioned to put this together, and Mother Gonzague said, well, she wrote the first part for you, the second part to Marie, and the third part for me, but make it all look like it was written to me. So I mean, I think Marie de Gonzague was saying for consistency, but I mean, others say, well, what was that all about? But so Pauline puts this together in the form we know as Story of a Soul out of these 3 manuscripts. But to do that, she had to edit it also. She like some of the people that Therese talks about were still alive, so she had to make sure that Therese didn't say anything that would offend them or hurt their feelings. Some things Therese had expressed kind of awkwardly and so on. So Pauline, quote unquote, improved what Therese had written. And so a year after Theresa's death, this is ready, and they print 2,000 copies, and everybody's scratching their heads saying, what are we ever going to do with 2,000 copies of this? How will we ever get rid of them? And yet, as soon as it started being distributed, there were requests for more copies. And so much so that the community had to republish it each year afterwards. And they began adding in other things, or poems or letters and so on, more and more material. Letters begin pouring into the Lisieux Carmel, expressing gratitude for favors granted through Theresa's intercession, or asking for relics or pictures, or requesting more information about her. And so they had to publish a whole series of things about Thérèse. So her fame is spreading. Now, once it was discovered that Pauline had heavily edited the original manuscripts, there was a hue and a cry saying, well, we want the authentic Thérèse. We don't know, what did Pauline do? Maybe she, maybe the story of his soul is really Pauline, not Thérèse. So they put together and published a facsimile edition of the autobiographical manuscripts, and you can see pieces of that up there in the upper right. I mean, it's an interesting edition, because they even bind the notebooks in the same kind of binding that Thérèse used, and so on. So it's very much, you can actually read Theresa's handwriting there and see what she wrote. And they've gone through and also edited all her other writings as well. So now those are all available in a critical edition. And you have not just Story of a Soul, but you have her letters in 2 volumes. You have her poetry, her prayers, her last conversations, her plays, and so on. So it ends up being quite a lot of material. I've often said, I don't know what it was about the culture at that time, but it seems like people saved everything. So, I mean, her family saved all kinds of things. Thérèse, and in the Carmel, they still, they're still bringing out new things from Thérèse that haven't been previously published, like, copybook exercises from school or things like that, or a map of America that she drew when she was 10 or something like that. So there's still many things people are learning about Thérèse. One of the things that increased her fame a lot was actually what happened in World War I. Soldiers were praying to her for protection, for help during, while they were in the trenches and so on. And there were countless stories of Thérèse and World War I veterans that, of her even appearing in the trenches, or they'd see a figure in brown walking along or something like that. Well, those favors and others were put together in volumes by the Lisieux Carmel, and there was a whole series called A Shower of Roses, Pluie de Roses, that I forget how many volumes it came to, but they were just, you can see already in those one below, you've got volume 2 and volume 5, and these are big volumes of people writing to say what, and some of the stories are quite remarkable of what favors they were granted through the intercession of Thérèse. There are her photos, her images, and so on. So Pius X opens the process to canonize her in 1914, and Benedict XV, not Benedict XVI, Benedict XV dispensed with that usual 50-year delay between death and beatification. So they were able to accelerate Theresa's process. She was beatified in 1923 and canonized in 1925 by Pius XI, and he called her the star of my pontificate. And there were unprecedented crowds in St. Peter's for these events. You see this picture here. It says entry of the St. Therese banner into St. Peter's in Rome on the day of her canonization, 17th of May, 1925. They're bringing in this big banner of Therese in procession. You see the huge crowd there. And they did something then which they don't normally do, which they lit all these candles that are hanging down there. You see, I mean, you don't normally, when you go to St. Peter's, you don't see it decorated like that. But for Therese, yes. And we know many saints and blesseds and popes and bishops and theologians and artists and so on have all been admirers of Therese. She's cited frequently in the Catechism. And their countries dedicated to, she's their patron, Catholic groups, parishes, religious orders, and so on. Her writings have been translated into every major language. There have been endless number of books written about her. This is, John Paul is the one who declared her a doctor of the church, and he said, her ardent spiritual journey shows such maturity, and the insights of faith expressed in her writings are so vast and profound that they deserve a place among the great spiritual masters. And this is a young girl of 24. You know that Mother Teresa of Calcutta, she's not named for Teresa of Avila, she's named for Thérèse of Lisieux. That was her patron. So do we need LJ to take a little pause, or shall I go on to talk about Therese's doctrine?
I think you can keep going, Father Stephen.
Okay. There should be time for questions at the end, I think. I believe this is a mosaic in the big basilica to Thérèse that's there in Avila. But let's talk first about her doctrine of the little way. Now, I was mentioning that she's named a doctor of the church. That's a picture of the basilica in Lisieux behind her that they built in honor of Thérèse. It's a huge basilica. But traditionally, to be named a doctor of the church, you have to fulfill 3 qualifications: outstanding holiness, eminence of doctrine, and an official declaration by a pope or council. Now, the first and the third requirement have never really posed any problems because they've only ever named saints as doctors. So the outstanding holiness is taken care of, and it's always been done through some kind of official process. But there's still question about what makes for eminent doctrine. I mean, you become a doctor of the church not just because you're a great saint. I mean, Joan of Arc was a great saint, but she's not a teacher in the same way as somebody like Thérèse, Maria Goretti, or others, and so on. They, it has to be more than just that you promoted a devotion or that you were very holy. You have to have some kind of eminent doctrine. And who was Thérèse? I mean, she'd never published a Summa Theologiae or even any book at all. She wasn't a trained theologian. But what made it easier to argue that Thérèse was qualified to be a doctor was that you had a whole series of popes and other Vatican officials and Vatican documents that spoke about her doctrine of the little way. So they'd already attributed a doctrine. They use the word doctrine in talking about Thérèse. And when you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you can look in the index that it was written before she was a doctor of the church, but she's cited more often than many of the other previously declared doctors. So, there was a case to be made then that Thérèse deserved to be a doctor of the church for her teachings. And when the Pope St. John Paul II officially made her a doctor of the church, in the homily he gave, he noted that when you make somebody a doctor of the church, that means that saint's doctrine, professed and proclaimed, can be a reference point for theologians and for all the faithful, because it, quote, sheds new light on the mysteries of faith and a deeper understanding of Christ's mystery. So that's what they're saying now by making her a doctor of the church. That's what Thérèse has for us. New light on the mysteries of faith, deeper understanding of Christ's mystery. So what does she teach us? Well, she's best known for the little way, of course. It's often called the little way of spiritual childhood, but actually Thérèse never uses that full phrase, little way of spiritual childhood. That was how her sisters expressed it, because that seemed like a good summary of some of the key points about what is this little way. But Thérèse does talk about having a little way, and that she wants to share that with others. She says at the end of her life, she says, I feel my mission is about to begin, my mission of making God loved as I love him, and of giving my little way to souls. So she understands that, as something that she's discovered that she needs to share. Now, this little way, Therese's understanding of it evolved gradually. And as I said, most of her doctrine arose out of reflecting on her personal experience in the light of faith. when she was young, she was, she was very concerned about being good, never committing a sin, always doing what she was supposed to, and so on. She was hypersensitive about any small failing that she might have. And we know for a time she struggled with scruples. So she was concerned about this issue of holiness. And in her time, I mean, we say, I'm caricaturing in a way and generalizing, so bear with me. I mean, you can say, well, surely not everybody was this way, and they weren't. But French Catholic piety of her time was still somewhat affected by Jansenism, and there was a lot of stress on performing good deeds, practicing penances and virtues, and so on. So Therese was taught as a young girl to use virtue beads, or sometimes called sacrifice beads, to tally up her virtuous acts. You take this around, and all during the day, whenever you do a good deed, you pull one of the beads so that you can figure out how many good deeds you've done in the day. My novice master once told me, when he was, they were still using them, and he said you could tell if another friar didn't like you very much if, when he greeted you nicely, you could see him reach in and pull up a virtue bead, so that he'd done a good deed. Also the French Catholic piety of her time often focused on reparation for offenses against God. As I said before, the nuns in the French Carmels were admired for offering themselves as victims of God's offended justice, taking on themselves the punishment due to sinners. In fact, they used to send around, when a sister would die, the other Carmels would receive a notice about her life. Sometimes these sisters had offered themselves as victims of God's justice and had suffered some terrible final illness. Therese, that didn't quite attract her. But also that kind of reparation theme was the focus of Holy Face devotion, which was promoted by another Carmelite nun before Therese, Sister Mary of St. Peter. Some of you may have seen the book called The Golden Arrow, which describes some of her revelations about the Holy Face, and that she felt she was being asked to promote devotion to the Holy Face, to make reparation for blasphemies against the holy name and the profanation of Sundays. This is that Mary of St. Peter. She felt that was what she was called to do. And Therese's family were members of the Confraternity of the Holy Face, if I'm not mistaken. But Therese has a different approach. She doesn't really say so much about reparation. She talks about love and mercy. After she's been in Carmel for a few years, and she's hardly an old woman, but she's realizing she's far from where she wanted to be in terms of the ideal of holiness that she had as a child. And it doesn't look good, she says, compared to these great saints, I'm just a little grain of sand. So how can I aspire to become like them? But this is typical logic of Therese. She often comes back to this theme where she says, well, she believes this desire to be holy is inspired by God, and God doesn't inspire unrealizable desires. So there must be another way to that goal. And rather than conquering holiness by sheer effort, by counting up her virtues and so on, she comes to realize that the secret is to remain little and to surrender to God in total confidence and love, like a little child. That's where in the Story of a Soul, where she talks about this way she wants that's totally new and very short, and she's looking for an elevator to God. It's not really totally new, because she goes on to say how she was reading the scriptures and she came upon the prophecies where it says, as a mother comforts her child, so will I comfort you, and so on. God, God wants to care for the little ones and so on. And all you have to do is entrust yourself to the Lord. But this becomes her little way. I have that quote there: to remain a child before God means to recognize our nothingness, to expect everything from God. It is not to become discouraged over our failings, for children fall often, but they are too little to hurt themselves very much. So stay little, stay humble. So sometimes when you ask people, well, what is the little way of Saint Therese? They'll say, well, it means doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. And that's part of it, but it's only part of it. And in fact, that could become problematic if you start to think that the little things you're doing, the ordinary things, are heroic somehow, that they're great accomplishments. Sometimes biographies, there's a famous biography of Therese by Ida Goris, who was starts out a bit skeptical about Story of a Soul, because in the popular piety within which she was writing, all these books were being written about, oh, how wonderful Saint Therese was, that she got splashed and she didn't complain, or she didn't complain about the sister who was making noise in the choir, or all these or the sister that was grumbling when she helped her go to the dining room. And Ida Gora says, but that's what everybody has to do. And yes, that's the point, really. Therese doesn't think these are great deeds of heroism. These are little things, but it's what she has to offer. And so that's what she's going to offer. Every little sacrifice, every glance and word, the doing of the least of actions for love. So she says, I can't do great things. I'm a Carmelite nun in this little Carmel in a off the beaten track in France. But I'm going to take every opportunity that comes my way to do something. Not that I'm going to earn my salvation or become holy by these acts that I'm doing, but rather so that I can show my gratitude. Like a little child, how little children, she'll say, will go and pick little flowers for their parents, or makes a placemat out of popsicle sticks or something like that. They just want to do something for their parents, and their parents are delighted by that. Therese knows that what she has to offer, that they're really nothings, but she says God can take those nothings and make them bear fruit for others. So the important thing is to keep doing everything we can for the love of God, not so that we can somehow earn our own holiness, but as an expression of our love for God, that He will use what we do. As she says, when one loves, one does not calculate. So she didn't need virtue beads later in life, but she looked for every opportunity. And in her oblation to merciful love, she writes, in the evening of this life, I shall appear before you with empty hands. For I do not ask you, Lord, to count my works. All our justice is stained in your eyes. I wish then to be clothed in your own justice and to receive from your love the eternal possession of yourself. So it's not just doing ordinary things with extraordinary love, but it's putting, after all of that, putting our total confidence not in what we've done, but in God's mercy. And this comes out again in what became chapter 9 of Story of a Soul. That came about because her sister Marie had asked for Therese to explain her little way in a little more detail. And Therese had written this nice long letter to her about it. And when Marie read it, that was where Therese talks about how she had the desire to be an apostle and a martyr and a priest and all these other things, and feeling frustrated that she couldn't give 1,000 lives for the Lord. And Marie writes back, well, you're much holier than I am because I don't feel those desires for martyrdom and so on. And Therese writes back to her, she says, well, you kind of missed the point. She says, my desires of martyrdom are nothing. They're not what gives me the unlimited confidence that I feel in my heart. They are, to tell the truth, the spiritual riches that render one unjust when one rests in them with complacence and when one believes they are something great. I must be a great person because I have this desire for martyrdom. No, she says, I really feel that it's not this at all that pleases God in my little soul. What pleases him is that he sees me loving my littleness and my poverty, the blind hope that I have in his mercy. And why would this treasure not be yours? So, this little way of confidence and love and trust in God's mercy is available to everyone. So besides doing ordinary things with extraordinary love, it means putting boundless confidence not in ourselves, but in God's infinite merciful love. So that's why sometimes it's called the way of confidence and love. Um, and That's why Therese says at the very last lines of Story of a Soul, as she's getting weak and she's writing now just in pencil, and it kind of breaks off there, but she says, even if she had all the sins of the world on her conscience, she'd still throw herself into the arms of merciful love with the same confidence, because God wants to forgive sinners. God wants to welcome the prodigal son and so on. So she's never discouraged. That she trusts that like a child, when a child has done something wrong, the parent may have to punish in some way or something. But if the child comes back and throws himself into the parent's arms, all is soon forgiven. And I think this is why souls who are struggling find her so appealing too. That no matter what we have on our conscience, no matter what our limitations are, we can still go to God with that same trust and confidence. Okay, let me see how we're doing on time. We're almost at an hour. But maybe should I keep going and do a couple other themes, LJ, or should we pause?
Please go ahead, keep going.
Okay. So there you see Thérèse as the teacher. Again, that's a statue of her outside her basilica in Lisieux. I would say that, I mean, this little way, this insight into God as merciful love is at the root of all her other teachings. For example, she's what we were just saying, that she feels this desire to make love loved. She wants to be an apostle, a prophet, a martyr, and so on, which she can't be. So what is she going to do? She reads 1 Corinthians 12 and 13, and she sees that love comprises all vocations, and without love, the apostle wouldn't preach, the martyr wouldn't give his or her life, and so on, and that love includes all vocations. And so that's where she says, my vocation, at last I found it. My vocation is love. And in the heart of the church, I will be love. That's what she's called to do as a Carmelite. I mean, that's well known, and it's a personal discovery of her own personal vocation, but it really has broad implications. I mean, one of the things she's realizing there is that that this contemplative life she's chosen to live as an enclosed nun really has an apostolic meaning and purpose. That as love in the heart of the church, her prayer is helping to empower all of the those who are out there on the front lines, the prophets, the martyrs, the apostles, and so on. So she's doing this not for her own sake to become a holier person, but this is her way of helping to make love loved. Love is the ultimate purpose of every vocation in the church. And some theologians have talked about Therese having an ecclesiology of love. I mean, she sees the whole mystical body of Christ and the church itself as constructed on the basis of love. Regarding divine justice and mercy, I mean, she's living at a time where people are very much afraid of God's divine justice. Is he going to punish me? Am I going to go to hell? And all of that. Maybe we're too little concerned about that these days, but it was strong in Therese's day. And some of, like, her missionary brothers, one of them was very concerned about the state of his soul and his sinful life before he became a priest. Was this going to mean that he would that God would refuse him? But Therese writes that she says there's no conflict between God's mercy and justice. She tells him, God is all merciful precisely because he's all just, because he knows our weakness, our littleness, our struggles, and so on. And, as the Gospels tell us, that it's the weak and the sinners who have the greatest claim on God's mercy. So acknowledging our own weakness, our own sinfulness, is a way of laying claim to that merciful love. And she writes, that, I mean, she thought about the fact that, I mean, in her life, she recognized that she'd been blessed to avoid some of the serious sins that other people had fallen into. But again, she says that it's not because she was so strong or innately good, but that in her case, she felt like God, the loving Father, had kind of removed some of the temptations or stumbling blocks from her path ahead of time. And that's the only reason that she hadn't fallen into even worse sins. So her, her life was all part of God's mercy. So it was only by God's prevenient grace, his foreseeing grace, that like a loving Father, he spared her from falling. And she says there, oh, how happy I am to see myself imperfect and to have such a need of God's mercy at the moment of my death. Uh, Another interesting sidelight, Therese was a great proponent of frequent communion. And, in her time, communion was relatively rare, and you had to spend a lot of time preparing for it, and so on. Were you worthy to receive? But Therese encourages people to receive communion as a spiritual help precisely for the weak and the struggling. So she's advising people to go to communion as often as they can, not in a state of mortal sin, of course, but that don't stay away because you feel unworthy. Because this will help you. And Pius X, who was the one who changed the discipline to allow more frequent communion, he was delighted when he learned that Therese had agreed with him when she was alive. About Mary, in Therese's time, there was a tendency to kind of exalt Mary's privileges. She's the Immaculate Conception. She's the, Queen of Heaven and all of that. But I mean, the way Therese saw it, all of that was well and true, but it kind of separated Mary from our own personal experience, raising her above everybody else. Therese wanted a Mary who was closer. In her last conversation, she says, I must see her real life, not her imagined life. I'm sure that her real life was very simple. They show her to us as unapproachable, but they should present her as imitable, bringing out her virtues, saying that she lived by faith just like ourselves. We know very well that the Blessed Virgin is Queen of Heaven and Earth, but she is more mother than queen. That's a famous line of Therese's. She has a lot in Story of a Soul about how to deal with the inevitable challenges of community life. If you read Story of a Soul, it's very interesting in the later chapters, some of what she says about trying to live in a community with some difficult people. And I think a lot of that advice she has there is transferable to family situations, work situations, and so on, and some strategies for how to do that. Trying to bear with our neighbor's defects, not being surprised at their weaknesses, being edified by their smallest virtues. What about Therese's trial of faith? Well, I mean, again, I'm kind of oversimplifying, but I would say in Therese's day that Catholic piety tended to look on sinners, atheists, and so on as enemies of the church, that you had to fight them to defend the church against attacks and so on. But what Therese says in Story of a Soul about her trial of faith during the last 18 months, she chooses to be in, now that she's kind of lost that vivid sense of the reality of heaven, she chooses to sit at the table in solidarity with poor sinners and those who have no faith, because she still has faith, but she wants to be with them, pleading for God's mercy on their behalf. And again, I think this may be a reason why many people who otherwise feel far from God feel that they have a friend in Therese, because she wants to be a friend of everybody, even of the atheists, even of the worst sinners. In Therese's time, people pictured eternal life as eternal rest. You go off to the next world where you ponder the beatific vision all day. Maybe you play the harp, whatever. But Therese wanted an active heaven. She wanted to participate in God's saving love for all his creatures, especially the little ones. She says again in Last Conversations, if God answers my desires, my heaven will be spent on earth until the end of the world. Yes, I want to spend my heaven in doing good on earth. This isn't impossible, since from the bosom of the beatific vision, the angels watch over us. I can't rest as long as there are souls to be saved. So again, she's got a little interesting theological argument, that even though angels behold the beatific vision, that doesn't stop them from helping us And similarly, she feels that even if she's beholding the beatific vision in heaven, she still wants to be involved in helping people with their struggles on earth. The universal call to holiness. Now, Therese never uses this expression, but in her time, I mean, it was still, holiness was still kind of thought of in elite terms, that there's a spiritual elite who are the holy ones, and the rest of us kind of struggle along. And Therese was often puzzled by the fact that God seemed to create great souls and little souls. There are the heroes, the biggest saints, and so on. You remember that she tells about how when she was asking that question, her sister Pauline brought I think it was like a glass and a thimble and filled them both to the brim with water. She said, which one is most full? Therese said, well, they both are. And Pauline says, well, that's how it is, that the little ones in heaven, they may just be a thimble, but they're as full of God's grace as they're capable of being. And that if it weren't for this wonderful variety in creation, that everything would be much more boring. I mean, that's part of the beauty, is that God created so many different souls with so many different capacities and so on, but each one called to be just what God wants us to be. Holiness, as she says, consists simply in doing God's will and in being just what he wants us to be. And that's a kind of a precursor to the universal call to holiness. Now, she's not cited in the documents of Vatican II, but I've read that she was often discussed in the working groups that were preparing the material. So I think she had an influence one way or another on that keynote of Vatican II, that stress on the fact that we're all called to holiness. So her little way is really meant for all. So let me go to my conclusion here. We've said again at the beginning, that Christian mysticism has to do with a direct and transformative presence of God. And so over these 4 sessions with you, I've tried to look at 4 Carmelite mystics, focusing on how they can lead us to a deeper encounter with this presence. I think just hit on a few key points here. There's much more that I could have put in here, but I think Teresa of Avila tells us to keep Christ present. That was her way of praying, and to take time frequently to be alone with the one who we know loves us. So a prayer for her is an intimate sharing with our friend Christ, and that who's always with us. John of the Cross insists that God is often most present in those times when we feel most abandoned. So the fact that we're not feeling his presence doesn't mean that God's not present. God is always there. God is always there at the center of our souls. Brother Lawrence encourages us to develop the habit of practicing the presence of God all day long by constantly reminding ourselves of God's presence, as we saw last time. And Thérèse of Lisieux teaches us a little way of complete confidence in God's ever-present, merciful love. So I think they're all talking in one way or another about this presence of God and how it can transform our lives. And that's why I think we can call them mystics. And there are others too that in the Carmelite tradition, like Elizabeth of the Trinity, Edith Stein, and so on, who we could maybe mention in another time. But I just want to thank you all. Thank the team at the Cathedral, LJ especially, and all of you for this time we've had together these past weeks. And I hope that you'll continue to get to know more about these Carmelite mystics, because I think they're wonderful companions on the spiritual journey. So keep reading them. If you want some resources, I mean, you can find things on Thérèse everywhere. Just go online, Amazon or something, and Google Thérèse of Lisieux, and you'll get hundreds of books and so on. But these are 4 places that I found helpful on the internet. If you go to, that's the website address for the Carmel of Lisieux, where Thérèse was. And they have on their website extensive archives, archival material and so on about Thérèse in both French and English. So even if you don't read French, there's a lot of material there. Again, this is, I guess, full disclosure. I work sometimes for ICS Publications, so I'm not just trying to steer you toward us for your business, but but it's true that we have the English translations of the critical editions of Therese's works. Now, there are lots of editions out there of Story of a Soul, because, you know, some are based on Pauline's first edition and so on. But the one we have, for example, was based on the critical edition that they did. And similarly with some of the other works. There's a wonderful website, if you want to go there, Maureen O'Riordan runs it, called St. Teresa of Lisieux Gateway. And again, she has tons of resources there on Therese, and whatever news there is on, you know, related to Therese, like some events that are coming up and so on. There's also the Society of the Little Flower, which has a national shrine and a museum out in Darien, Illinois, where they have a lot of her relics and so on. So if you go to their website, you can see what they have, and you see that a lot of the images I used in the slideshow were from the Little Flower, the Society of the Little Flower. So they put out a lot of nice material on Therese. And again, I say, as always, that I don't hold the copyright to any of the pictures that I've used in this presentation. So if anybody objects to my using them, they can obviously be taken off. So let me stop the share for now. And I think there's time for some questions. If anybody would like to ask a couple of questions, either well, it might be easiest to write them in as in the chat, and then LJ can.
Yes, if anybody has any questions, just type them in the chat, and I will ask Father Stephen for you. So we do have a question from Rita, Father Stephen. Can you expound on examples or ways in which one is or can be transformed by God? Dare these ways necessarily be things we are or need to be conscious of? Can you share some of these transformations you know of in the lives of different people?
Well, that would take a whole extra 10 conferences, I suppose. But well, that's one of the things I was trying to do when we did the series on John of the Cross and the talk on him. But I think all of them would agree that the transformation that's most important for Christians is becoming conformed to Christ. And so whatever we can do to help that come about, to draw closer to Christ, get to know Christ. I mean, this is part of Teresa's approach to prayer. If it's a conversation with Christ, we should also be reading about the Lord, praying to him, sharing time with him, and so on. And gradually that way our wills become more and more conformed to God's will. And that's the kind of ultimately the transformation that's most important. And gradually that way, you know, we let go of some of the obstacles to God's grace in our lives, and we allow it to transform us more and more. And I don't know, it would be a little presumptuous of me, I think, to try to say who I think has become transformed or has reached the unitive way, and so on. But I think, you know, really holy people are those we meet in life who, I mean, they may not even be terribly overtly religious, but they just seem to have reached a state of inner peace and selflessness, and they're, you know, they're loving, and they're not so concerned about themselves but about others, and that to me is what it means to be, you know, at least part of what it means to be transformed into other Christs. Sorry, that's about the best I can do with that at this point. I see another question there. Do you notice any particular aspects of Therese that appeal to young persons today who've generally not been brought up in a Catholic world? Well, again, I'm far from young myself, so I probably shouldn't talk about young people. I realized, I calculated, I'm 3 times the age she was when she died. But I mean, it's true that she appeals to young people, and she's almost always a patron at World Youth Day. And I think just her you know, her zeal, her enthusiasm for the Lord, and how transformative it was for her, and so on. Yeah, I think that young people, one time, sometimes people trip over her language, because sometimes that French style of her time could be very flowery, but if people don't get lost in that, then they begin to see. I mean, she's got really a wonderful story, and you know, you can identify with her. Some of the struggles that she went through, I think we all go through. Um, but that's about as well as I can do with that, Maureen, at this point. Sorry. Anyone else?
Yes,
Well,
Father Stephen,
yeah.
there's one more question, it seems.
Okay. Okay.
This is from Joseph. He says, it seems that Therese had God ever present in all her thoughts, as we can see in her letters, communications to her family. Could this have been a grace given her in the Christmas conversion that she received? Or is this something that she strived for personally?
Well, I think, I mean, the way she was brought up in that was a family that had a very vivid sense of the presence of God, even before Therese arrives on the scene. I mean, they were extremely devout. So she's being raised in a very pious Catholic family. She's being taken to Mass all the time, and devotions and so on. So that's, you know, she's brought up in that atmosphere. So the reality of God is something that she just imbibed from her earliest age. I'm sure that the Christmas conversion helped, because she says, you know, that she felt felt the love enter her heart, and so on. And so I, you know, I know it. There were various stages in her sense of the presence of God, but I think that, you know, unlike a lot of us, that was very vivid to her from a relatively young age. So that's my impression. But if someone else sees it differently, by all means say so. Okay, well, I thought, now we still, if those of you who want to continue a little bit longer, I was going to read one of her poems as a closing prayer, and then if I can get it to work, and I haven't always had success with this, but there's a piece of music that was written by Sister Claire Sokol of the Carmel in Reno, called Therese's Canticle of Love. And you can order, I mean, a proper version of that from the Carmel in Reno if you just Google that, and they have it in different arrangements and so on. But I see that somebody posted a version of that with the words, with the lyrics, and so on. I don't think, I mean, they may have pirated it from the sisters, but we can listen to it and you can see the words of the song. It'll be a good way to close. So let me read the poem first as a closing prayer. And remember, now she's writing this close to the end of her life, in her final year. This is written in January of 1897. It's a poem called My Joy. Not one of her most famous, but it's got a lot of beautiful thoughts in it. There are some souls on earth who search in vain for happiness, but for me it's just the opposite. Joy is in my heart. This joy is not ephemeral. I possess it forever, like the springtime rose. It smiles at me every day. Truly, I'm so happy. I always have my way. How could I not be joyful and not show my cheerfulness? My joy is to love suffering. I smile when shedding tears. I accept with gratitude the thorns mingled with the flowers. When the blue sky becomes somber and begins to abandon me, my joy is to stay in the shadow, to hide and humble myself. My joy is the holy will of Jesus, my only love. So I live without any fear. I love the night as much as the day. My joy is to stay little. So when I fall on the way, I can get up very quickly. And Jesus takes me by the hand. Then I cover him with caresses and tell him he's everything for me. And I'm twice as tender when he slips away from my faith. If sometimes I shed tears, my joy is to hide them well. Oh, how many charms there are in suffering when one knows how to hide it with flowers. I truly want to suffer without saying so, that Jesus may be consoled. My joy is to see him smile when my heart is exiled. My joy is to struggle unceasingly to bring forth spiritual children, It's with a heart burning with tenderness that I keep saying to Jesus, for you, my divine little brother, I'm happy to suffer. My only joy on earth is to be able to please you. Lord, I'm willing to live a long time more if that is your desire. I'd like to follow you to heaven if that would make you happy. Love, that fire from the homeland, never ceases to consume me. What do life and death matter to me? Jesus, my joy is to love you. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, pray for us. Now, was there anything we need to say, LJ, before I play this final song?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so again, thank you all for this time together, and feel free now. After the song, we'll close things up. Let me see if I can get it to work this time. Sorry. Let me go back again. That didn't work. Okay. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing. Here we go. Thank you all, and thank you for being part of this, and have a good evening and a great Holy Week and Easter. Yeah,
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you, Father Stephen. Take care.
sure.
Thank you, Father Stephen. Bye.
I think we're okay then. Bye, everyone. Thanks.